You think you know someone until you discover what that person is capable of doing when they feel threatened. My name is Isabella Rodriguez. I'm 28 years old, and I almost got arrested for a crime I didn't commit. All because I discovered that my millionaire boss was cheating on his wife, and I wanted to do the right thing. What started as a dream job in a mansion in Beacon Hill turned into a nightmare of persecution, blackmail, and threats that almost destroyed my life. But this story has twists you can't even imagine. Because in the end, we discovered that the affair was just the tip of the iceberg of much worse crimes. If you're curious to know how a simple housekeeper managed to bring down a millionaire corruption scheme and still came out victorious from this battle, stick around, because this story will show that sometimes justice comes from where we least expect it. And please, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you're watching from. I'm creating a community of people who aren't afraid to face the truth, no matter how powerful the enemies are. You guys have no idea how desperate I was for work when I received that call. It was a rainy Tuesday. I was down to my last dollar, literally counting coins to buy bread, when my phone rang. On the other side of the line, an elegant voice asked me if I was still looking for employment as a housekeeper. My heart raced. Finally, an opportunity after months of knocking door to door, being rejected by families who wanted references I didn't have. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Wellington, wife of a successful businessman from Boston, and said she had gotten my contact through an acquaintance. She explained that she needed someone trustworthy to take care of their house, a mansion in Beacon Hill, and that the salary would be very generous. The next day, I was standing in front of that imposing house with its white columns and impeccable gardens, feeling like I had entered a movie. Mrs. Brielle Wellington received me at the door, a woman around 40 years old, blonde, elegant, one of those you see in lifestyle magazines. She wore a Chanel outfit that probably cost more than my rent for an entire year. The house was a spectacle in itself. Italian marble on the floor, crystal chandeliers, artwork on the walls that I had only seen in museums. Each room was bigger than my entire apartment in Roxbury. During the interview, she explained that I would be responsible for general cleaning, organization, and some simple administrative tasks. What impressed me most was her kindness. She treated me with respect, offered coffee in a fine porcelain cup, and even asked about my family. The salary she offered left me speechless. It was 3 times more than I earned at my last job. Besides that, she said I could eat freely in the kitchen and that I would have bonuses for good performance. It was literally the answer to all my prayers. I would be able to pay my bills on time, help my mother with her medicines, and still have money left to save. When she told me I could start the following Monday, I almost cried with relief. I left that house walking on clouds, calling my mother to tell her the good news. Finally, after so much struggle, things were working out in my life. I had no idea I was entering a trap that would change my life forever. My first day of work was like a fairy tale. I arrived at 7 in the morning sharp, wearing my best uniform, nervous but excited. Mrs. Wellington introduced me to the house routine, when to clean each room, how she liked things organized, where the imported cleaning products that cost a fortune were kept. The kitchen was a dream: giant stainless steel refrigerator, professional stove, a pantry bigger than my living room. She also showed me her husband's office, Mr. Harrison Wellington, a businessman who worked in the financial sector. On that first day, he barely appeared, just waved politely when we crossed paths in the hallway. Mrs. Wellington explained to me that he traveled a lot for work, and when he was home, he spent most of his time in his office. Everything seemed too perfect to be true. The first weeks were wonderful. I woke up every day excited to go to work, something that had never happened in my life. The house was a pleasure to take care of. Everything was top quality. The environments were spacious and well lit, and Mrs. Wellington always praised my work. She even gave me a raise after just 1 month, saying I was the best employee she had ever had. Sometimes, when she went out for her social commitments, spas, charity lunches, Pilates classes, I stayed alone in that mansion feeling like a princess. I could use the guest's social bathroom, which was bigger and more luxurious than any place I had ever lived. It was surreal to think that just a few months before I was unemployed and desperate. I really believed I had found my perfect family. Mr. Wellington also seemed to be an exemplary boss. Always polite, never treated me with contempt like other bosses I had in the past. He was handsome, one of those men who age well, graying hair at the temple. Always impeccably dressed, smell of expensive cologne. Sometimes he worked late in the office, and I brought coffee to him. He always thanked with a kind smile, and sometimes even asked how my mother was, since I had mentioned her diabetes. On weekends, when he didn't travel, I saw him by the pool reading the newspaper or talking on the phone about business. They seemed to have a solid marriage, always polite to each other. She always well-dressed when he arrived from trips, romantic dinners on the porch. It was the kind of relationship I dreamed of having one day. At least that's what I thought at the time. The work environment was so good that I started feeling like part of the family. Mrs. Wellington sometimes sat to talk with me while I cleaned, telling about the social events she attended, the places she traveled with her husband. She showed me photos of their vacations, paradisiacal beaches, five-star hotels, sophisticated restaurants. I lived that through her, dreaming that one day I could also have a life like that. Sometimes she even gave me clothes she didn't wear anymore, designer pieces I could never buy. It was like she was an older sister, helping me improve my life. I felt grateful and thought I had finally found people who valued my work and respected me as a human being. The trust she placed in me was something I had never experienced before. But you know how it is, right? When things are too good, it's usually because there's something wrong underneath. I just didn't imagine I was about to discover secrets that would put my life in danger. At that time, I was too naive to notice the signs that were right in my face. But anyway, that's talk for the next chapter of this crazy story that you can't even imagine where it's going to lead. It was in the third month working at the house that I started noticing weird things. At first, they were small details that I even ignored. You know how it is. You don't want to create problems where there aren't any, especially when you're in a dream job. But some situations started bothering me in a way I couldn't explain. Mr. Wellington was receiving strange calls, always answered in the office with the door closed, and when I passed in the hallway to clean, I heard him talking quietly, almost whispering. Once I knocked on the door to bring coffee, and he hung up the phone immediately, kind of nervous. He said it was just business, but his manner was different. There was something in his expression that didn't match the explanation he gave. It was like he had been caught doing something he shouldn't. His clothes also started catching my attention in a strange way. I was always detail-oriented with laundry. It's part of my job, right? But I started noticing different perfumes on his shirts, feminine perfumes that definitely weren't Mrs. Wellington's. She always used the same Chanel No. 5, a scent I already knew by heart. But these shirts came with sweeter, younger fragrances, completely different. Once I found a dark red lipstick in the pocket of one of his suits. Mrs. Wellington only wore pink and nude tones. When I mentioned to her, said I had found a lost lipstick, she was confused and said it wasn't hers. At the time, I thought maybe it was from some client of his or something like that, but that kept hammering in my head. Why the hell would a married man be walking around with another woman's lipstick in his pocket? His schedule also changed drastically. Before, Mr. Wellington had a very predictable routine, left for the office at 8, came back for dinner at 7. But lately, he started arriving later and later, always with different excuses. Meeting that extended business dinner, company event, Mrs. Wellington pretended she didn't mind, but I saw in her eyes a sadness she tried to hide. Several times she prepared special dinners and waited for him to arrive, only to discover he sent a last-minute message canceling. One night, she waited until midnight, dressed in a beautiful dress, impeccable makeup, candles lit on the table. When she finally gave up and went to the bedroom, I saw a tear roll down her face. That broke my heart, because she was genuinely a good person. The strange calls intensified and started happening even on weekends. Mr. Wellington said he was going to the office to solve urgent matters. But once I needed to go there to get some documents that Mrs. Wellington had forgotten, and the building was completely empty. Not even the doorman was there. How was he working in a closed building? When I discreetly questioned, he got irritated and said I shouldn't be checking where he was. His disproportionate reaction made me even more suspicious. An honest man doesn't get nervous when people ask where he was, right? And another thing, he started taking showers as soon as he got home, even when he said he had been sitting in an air-conditioned office all day. Why would someone who stays in a room with air conditioning need to shower urgently before even greeting his wife? I also started noticing that he was receiving expensive gifts that definitely weren't from Mrs. Wellington. Several times, flowers, imported chocolates, wine bottles arrived, always addressed to him. When Mrs. Wellington asked, he said they were from grateful clients. But what client sends flowers to a financial consultant? And they were always romantic arrangements, red roses, orchids, flowers you give to someone you're flirting with, not to thank for a professional service. Once a Victoria's Secret box arrived, addressed to him. When Mrs. Wellington saw it, he quickly said it was a gift he had bought for her and wanted to surprise her. But I saw her confused face. Clearly, she knew he was lying. The lingerie wasn't even her size. It was much smaller. His cell phone became practically an extension of his body. Before, he left his phone around without any problem. Now, he wouldn't let go of it even to go to the bathroom. Always with the device face down, always on silent, always protected with a password. Several times I saw him typing messages with a smile on his face, that kind of smile you make when you're flirting, you know? And when Mrs. Wellington approached, he hid the screen immediately. Once she made a joke about it, asked if he was exchanging messages with some girlfriend. He laughed, forced, and said it was just business, but he turned red like a pepper. His reaction was so suspicious that even I felt embarrassed to witness that blatant lie. His expenses also skyrocketed in a strange way. I kind of found out about these things because sometimes I organized his papers in the office. Expenses started appearing in expensive restaurants, hotels, jewelry stores, flower shops, always at times he should be working. And the worst, they were always 2 plates, 2 wines, 2 reservations. Mrs. Wellington mentioned once that he was spending a lot and she didn't understand on what. She said she questioned and he got angry, said she had no right to control his expenses. But people, they had been married for 15 years. Of course, she had the right to know where the family money was going. His defensiveness only confirmed that something wrong was happening. No honest man gets irritated when his wife asks about excessive spending. But what really worried me was when I started receiving strange looks from him. Before, Mr. Wellington barely noticed me. He was always polite, but distant, as it should be between boss and employee. But lately, I felt he was watching me when I cleaned. It wasn't my paranoia, no. It was that kind of look that makes you feel uncomfortable, like he was evaluating if I was trustworthy or if I represented some kind of threat. Sometimes I turned suddenly and caught him staring at me, then he quickly looked away. I started suspecting he was suspicious that I might be noticing the strange things that were happening. And you know what? He was right to be worried, because I was noticing everything. What he didn't imagine is that I was about to discover something much worse than he could imagine. The day that changed everything was a Thursday in March that I'll never forget. Mrs. Wellington had traveled to New York for a charity event and would be away until Sunday. Mr. Wellington said he would take advantage to work on some important projects without interruptions. I was finishing cleaning upstairs when I heard the front door open. I thought it was him coming back from lunch, so I went down to ask if he wanted anything. But when I got to the stairs, I heard voices, a feminine one that definitely wasn't Mrs. Wellington. It was a young voice with seductive giggles, speaking softly. My heart raced because I knew there shouldn't be anyone in the house besides the 2 of us. I hid behind the hallway wall and kept listening, trying to understand what was happening. The woman was talking about how she had missed him, how beautiful that house was, how they finally had total privacy. His voice was different, softer, affectionate, in a way I had never heard him speak to Mrs. Wellington. They were kissing, I could hear the sounds, and then they started going up the stairs, toward the master bedroom. My blood froze. The bastard was taking his mistress to the marital bed in their own house, in the bed where he slept with his wife. It was such a shameless betrayal, so shameless that I was paralyzed for a few seconds. I managed to hide in the guest suite closet before they passed through the hallway. My heart was beating so hard I was sure they were going to hear me. The situation was surreal. Me, a simple housekeeper, discovering the betrayal of my millionaire boss. From inside the closet, I could hear pieces of their conversation. She was complaining that he was taking too long to separate, that she was tired of being a mistress, that she wanted to make the relationship public. He said it was complicated, that Mrs. Wellington had a lot of money from her family, and that divorce would be financially devastating for him. The woman laughed and said that when they were officially together, they could travel the world, live in Paris, have a life without limits. It was disgusting to hear that man planning how he was going to destroy the life of the wife who trusted him. And the worst, he talked about Mrs. Wellington as if she were a financial obstacle, not a person with feelings. I discovered that the mistress's name was Scarlett, that she was about 25 years old and worked as a model. She was exactly the opposite of Mrs. Wellington, young, ambitious, and apparently without scruple. After about 40 minutes that seemed like an eternity, they went down to the kitchen. I managed to get out of the closet and position myself so I could see them without being seen. Scarlett was really beautiful. Curly red hair, sculptural body, expensive clothes. She was going through the refrigerator as if she owned the house, commenting on the wines in the cellar, talking about how she was going to redecorate everything when she moved there. Mr. Wellington was glued to her, kissing her neck, saying that soon they would be free to live their love without hiding. It was revolting to see how affectionate he was with her, completely different from the coldness he showed to Mrs. Wellington. They were planning a trip to the Bahamas the following month, using his corporate card. The cynic even joked, saying she was going to post photos on Instagram, tagging the resort as honeymoon. What shocked me most was discovering this wasn't the first time. They talked about other encounters in the house, always when Mrs. Wellington traveled. Scarlett knew every room, knew where things were, even mentioned that she liked to bathe in the master bedroom's hot tub. They had had sex in the couple's bed several times. She even commented that once they almost got caught because Mrs. Wellington came back early from a trip. But they managed to disguise it by saying Scarlett was a decoration consultant. The coldness with which they treated that situation made me sick. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was systematic and planned humiliation of a woman who didn't deserve to go through that. For almost 2 hours, I witnessed that degrading situation. They had sex again, this time in the living room, on the sofa where Mrs. Wellington used to read her magazine. Scarlett photographed various parts of the house and sent them to her friends, saying that soon that would be her house. They drank the reserve wine that Mrs. Wellington kept for special occasions, used the Chinese porcelain plates she inherited from her grandmother. It was like they were purposely profaning every corner of that house. Mr. Wellington even showed her Mrs. Wellington's jewelry, saying that soon she could wear all of that. Scarlett tried on a very expensive diamond necklace and said it looked much better on her than on the old woman. Mrs. Wellington was 42 years old and was beautiful. But for that bitch, any woman over 30 was considered old. The most revolting moment was when they started planning how they were going to get rid of Mrs. Wellington. Mr. Wellington said he was gathering false evidence that she had mental problems, that she drank in secret, that she had erratic behaviors. The idea was to build a case to get total custody of the assets in the divorce, claiming she was unstable. Scarlett even suggested they hire a private detective to fabricate evidence of infidelity on her part. It was a diabolical plan to completely destroy the reputation and financial life of an innocent woman. They were there, in her house, using her things, sleeping in her bed, and planning how they were going to ruin her life. At that moment, I knew I couldn't stay quiet. Mrs. Wellington needed to know what kind of snake she was nurturing in her bosom. When they finally left, I was alone in that huge house, shaking with anger and indignation. I spent the rest of the afternoon obsessively cleaning all the places they had been, as if that could erase the filth I had witnessed. I changed all the sheets, washed the glasses, reorganized everything. But the image of that betrayal wouldn't leave my head. I knew I had a very difficult decision ahead. Tell Mrs. Wellington and probably lose my job, or stay quiet and be an accomplice to that nastiness. That night, I couldn't sleep thinking about how a person could be so cruel to someone who trusted them. What I didn't imagine is that my decision to do the right thing was going to get me into a much bigger mess than I could imagine. The next 3 days were hell in my head. I couldn't look at Mrs. Wellington without feeling a tightness in my chest, knowing what I knew about her husband. When she came back from New York, she arrived all excited, telling about the charity event, showing photos of the beautiful dresses she had worn. She even brought gifts for me, artisanal chocolates and a silk scarf. She sat there in the kitchen, having tea with me, talking about how she had missed home, how the hotel apartment was beautiful, but nothing compared to their home. I forced smiles and made comments, but inside I was dying of anguish. How was I going to tell that sweet and generous woman that the man she loved was planning to destroy her life? It was like having to break the heart of someone you care about. The first person that came to my mind to ask for advice was my mother. I called her that same night and, without going into specific details, asked what she would do if she discovered that a friend was being cheated on. My mother, with that wisdom of someone who has lived a lot, said that the truth always ends up coming to light and that it's better to be discovered by someone who cares than by a stranger. She reminded me of how my father cheated on her for years and how she only found out when the situation was already unsustainable. If someone knew and had told me before, she said, I would have saved years of humiliation and pain. Those words kept echoing in my head throughout the dawn. My mother was right. Mrs. Wellington deserved to know the truth, no matter how painful it was. But then I started thinking about the practical consequences of the situation. I was a housekeeper, without higher education, without great references, and Mrs. Wellington was a rich and influential woman. If I told her about the betrayal, how was she going to react? Would she believe me, or think I was making up stories to cause problems? And even if she believed, what would happen after? Mr. Wellington would certainly fire me immediately, and probably would do everything to destroy my professional reputation in the city. People like him have connections, power, influence. He could easily defame me and ensure I never got work in Boston again. I had to think about my survival too. I couldn't just throw my future away on impulse, even if it was for the right reason. During Monday's breakfast, I observed the dynamic between them with different eyes. Mr. Wellington was, as usual, polite but distant, fiddling with his phone while eating. Mrs. Wellington tried to start conversation about plans for the weekend, but he responded with monosyllable, clearly uninterested. It was painful to see how she tried to maintain the connection while he barely looked at her. At one point, she commented that she had thought about redecorating the master bedroom, maybe changing the colors, buying new furniture. He quickly looked up and said he thought it was unnecessary, that the room was fine as it was. I knew the real reason. He didn't want to change anything because he was bringing his mistress there regularly. His coldness disgusted me, but also gave me more certainty that Mrs. Wellington needed to know who she was married to. I tried to put myself in her place and imagine how I would like to be treated in a situation like that. If I were the betrayed wife, would I want someone to tell me, even if it was painful? Absolutely yes. No one deserves to live in a lie, especially a lie as elaborate and cruel as that one. Mrs. Wellington was wasting the best years of her life with a man who not only didn't love her, but was also actively planning to destroy her. Every day that passed without her knowing was one more day of humiliation. I thought about how she dressed up for dinner with him, how she talked about him with pride to her friends, how she defended the marriage when other people made comments. It was heartbreaking to see so much dedication being wasted on someone who was worth nothing. The last straw was on Tuesday, when Mr. Wellington received a bouquet of flowers in the office. They were red roses with a card that said, "Can't wait for our weekend in Martha's Vineyard. I love you, S." Mrs. Wellington saw the flowers when she went to bring him coffee and asked who had sent them. He said it was from a client who had closed a big deal. But I saw the card in the trash later and knew it was a lie. Later, I heard him talking on the phone with Scarlett, arranging the details of the romantic trip they were going to take on the weekend. He told her he had made up an excuse about a work conference. Mrs. Wellington even commented to me that she was sad he had to work so much on weekends, but at least his career was going well. Her naivety broke my heart. That night, I made my final decision. The consequences didn't matter. I couldn't be an accomplice to that farce anymore. Mrs. Wellington was a good person, who didn't deserve to be deceived and humiliated that way. If I stayed quiet, I would be as guilty as Mr. Wellington for allowing that situation to continue. I prepared a strategy. I was going to tell her on Thursday when he traveled for work, which would actually be the romantic weekend with Scarlett. That way she would have time to process the information and decide what to do without the pressure of having to confront him immediately. I knew I would probably lose my job, but at least I would be able to sleep peacefully knowing I did the right thing. What I didn't imagine is that my decision to be honest was going to trigger a series of events that would put my own life at risk. If you're watching the video up to here, comment risk because I want to know how many of you are really following this crazy story. Thursday came and I was determined to tell everything to Mrs. Wellington. Mr. Wellington had left early for his business trip and she was in the garden having breakfast. Reading a decoration magazine. The scenario was perfect, just the two of us.com environment. Enough time for a serious conversation. I took a deep breath, approached her, and said I needed to talk about something very important. She looked at me with that gentle smile and told me to sit down. I started explaining that it was difficult for me to say that, but that I cared a lot about her and couldn't stay quiet anymore. Her smile gradually disappeared as I told about the strange calls, the different perfumes, the weird schedules. When I got to the part about last Thursday's discovery, she turned white as paper. Her hands trembled, holding the coffee cup. Her reaction was different from what I expected. Instead of exploding with rage or breaking down in tears, Mrs. Wellington became very quiet, processing every word I said. She asked some specific questions: what the woman looked like, what time they arrived, what exactly they said about the divorce. I answered everything honestly, including told about the diabolical plans they had to destroy her reputation. When I finished speaking, she was silent for about 5 minutes that seemed like an eternity. Finally, she thanked me for having the courage to tell and said she needed time to think about all that. She asked me not to comment with anyone until she decided what to do. I left that conversation with a mix of relief and worry. At least my conscience was clear, but I knew I had changed that family's life forever. The problem is that I completely underestimated Mrs. Wellington's ability to keep secrets. Actually, I discovered later that she had a very close circle of friends with whom she shared absolutely everything. Already on Friday morning, she called her best friend Patricia Morrison, a gossipy socialite who knew half of Boston. Mrs. Wellington told the whole story. From the suspicions to the discovery of the betrayal, Patricia was scandalized and, of course, couldn't keep the information to herself. By the end of the day, she had already told at least 3 other women in their social circle. Each one promised to keep it secret, but we know how those promises work, right? Especially when the subject is a scandalous betrayal involving a known couple in Boston's high society. The buzz spread like wildfire. Boston is a big city, but the elite circles are very small and close. Everyone knows everyone, especially when it comes to scandals. By Sunday, the story had already reached the ears of at least 15 different people. Each one told their version, adding details here and there, speculating about things they didn't know. Some said Mr. Wellington had been having an affair for years. Others talked about the mistress being pregnant. There were even those who invented that he was embezzling money from the company to finance her life. The gossip took on a life of its own and grew far beyond the reality I had witnessed. It was like that telephone game we played as children. The original message transformed into something completely different. Monday morning, when Mr. Wellington returned from the business trip, the damage was already done. He arrived home relaxed, tanned, clearly satisfied with the romantic weekend he had spent with Scarlett. Mrs. Wellington received him normally, as if nothing had happened, but I noticed the tension in the air. During lunch, the phone rang and it was one of her friends wanting to know how she was going through this difficult situation. Mr. Wellington frowned, clearly confused by the comment. Later, when he left for a meeting, he received a strange look from the doorman of the building where his office is. In the elevator, two acquaintances whispered something when he passed. He still wasn't connecting the dots, but already noticed that something was different in people's treatment. His penny only dropped on Tuesday when his partner, Richard Baldwin, called him for a private conversation. Richard said that some very serious rumors were circulating about his personal life and that this could affect the company's reputation. He didn't go into details, but made it clear that he knew about the betrayal and was worried about the professional implications. Mr. Wellington became desperate and started investigating how the information had leaked. That's when he discovered that several people were commenting about the case, all citing the same source, a housekeeper who had caught everything. It didn't take long for him to connect the dots and realize that I was the origin of all that problem. The anger I saw in his eyes when he got home that afternoon gave me chills down my spine. That same night, I heard him and Mrs. Wellington having a heated argument in the bedroom. He was accusing her of spreading lies about him, demanding to know who had invented those stories. Mrs. Wellington denied any involvement, said she didn't know what he was talking about. But I noticed she was lying. Her voice was shaky, insecure. Mr. Wellington threatened to sue whoever was defaming him, said he was going to find the source and make the person pay dearly for destroying his reputation. It was at that moment I realized I had gotten into a much bigger mess than I imagined. It wasn't just a matter of losing my job anymore. That man was furious and clearly willing to do anything to protect his image. The gossip I thought would stay restricted to the couple had turned into a public scandal that threatened his career and social status. On Wednesday morning, Mrs. Wellington called me to talk in the garden. She was visibly nervous and said the situation had gotten out of control. She apologized for telling her friends, explained that she was very shaken and needed emotional support. But now she was sorry because Mr. Wellington was suspecting that the information had come from inside the house. She advised me to be careful, said he was investigating and would probably discover that I was the source. At that moment, I realized my life was about to turn upside down. What started as an attempt to help a betrayed woman had turned into a bomb that was about to explode in my face. The explosion happened on Thursday morning. I was cleaning the living room when Mrs. Wellington entered like a hurricane, slamming the door so hard that the pictures on the wall shook. Her face was red with rage, her eyes shining in a way I had never seen before. She screamed my name with a voice that gave me chills and told me to sit immediately. My heart raced because I knew the moment of truth had arrived. During the night, Mr. Wellington had managed to trace the origin of the gossip through her friends and discovered that everything started with my conversation with her. The reaction I expected to be directed at the cheating husband was being poured all over me. It was as if I were to blame for that whole situation, not him. She started accusing me of making up lies about her husband out of envy and malice. According to her, I was a frustrated employee who couldn't stand seeing the couple's happiness and had decided to destroy their marriage with false story. She screamed that I was a calculating person who had planned everything from the beginning to cause problems in the family. Mrs. Wellington said she always suspected me, that I was too observant, too curious, always asking questions about their personal life. She accused me of going through Mr. Wellington's personal things, of reading private correspondence, of violating the family's privacy. It was surreal to hear those accusations coming from the same woman who, just a few days before, had thanked me for telling the truth. Her anger was so intense that I could barely recognize the kind person I knew. What shocked me most was when she said I was in love with Mr. Wellington and that the whole betrayal story was a desperate attempt to separate them so I could be with him. The accusation was so absurd that I was speechless. How could she think that I, a housekeeper, would be romantically interested in my boss? But she was convinced that I had invented the mistress, that I had forged the evidence, that I had set up that whole farce because I was obsessed with him. She said she had noticed how I looked at him, how I always found excuses to go to his office, how I stayed longer in the house when he was present. It was a completely distorted interpretation of normal situations from my work, but in her head, it made perfect sense. Mrs. Wellington then told me that Mr. Wellington had a perfectly logical explanation for all the suspicious behaviors I had mentioned. The private calls were about a surprise investment he was preparing for their wedding anniversary. The different perfumes came from meetings with female clients who used strong fragrances. The lipstick in the pocket was from a work colleague who had asked him to keep it during a presentation. The strange schedules were because of a secret project that would involve an important promotion at the company. Every point I had raised had a plausible justification in his version. And the most incredible thing, he had proof of all this documents. Emails, messages that proved his version of the facts. It was impressive how he had managed to build such a convincing alternative narrative in such a short time. The most painful part was when she said I had destroyed an innocent man's reputation out of pure malice. According to Mrs. Wellington, Mr. Wellington was devastated by the gossip, had cried when he found out people were questioning his fidelity. He was considering suing everyone involved in the defamation, including me. She said I had publicly humiliated a respectable family man, that I had stained the name of a serious company, that I had caused irreparable damage to their image in society. The guilt she was throwing at me was overwhelming, as if I were responsible for all the problems they were facing. It was a total inversion of reality. The cheater became the victim, and I became the villain of the story. Mrs. Wellington also accused me of breaking the trust she placed in me when she hired me. She said I had abused the access I had to their house, that I had used my position to spy and cause problems. She said she always treated all employees like family, that she gave me opportunities other people wouldn't give, that she trusted me with her most precious things, and that I repaid all that generosity by trying to destroy their marriage. The way she spoke made me feel like I was really a terrible, ungrateful, and malicious person. For some moments, I even doubted my own sanity. Had I really imagined everything? Had I really invented the betrayal in my head? But then she said something that made me sure that Mr. Wellington had completely brainwashed her. Mrs. Wellington stated that I had obvious psychological problem, that I was an unstable person who confused fantasy with reality. She said I probably needed medical help, that I had a sick obsession with dramas that led me to invent situations that didn't exist. According to her, I watched too many soap operas, read too many gossip magazines, and had started projecting these stories into their real life. It was exactly the same type of accusation I had heard Mr. Wellington planning to use against her. He had simply reversed the script and was using the strategy he planned for his wife against me. The manipulation was so subtle and effective that even Mrs. Wellington, the very victim of the betrayal, was defending the cheater and attacking the one who tried to help her. At the end of that devastating conversation, Mrs. Wellington said she was giving me one last chance because of all the years of dedicated work. I could stay in the job if I publicly admitted I had invented the whole story, if I apologized to Mr. Wellington, and if I committed to undoing the rumors I had spread. Otherwise, I would be fired immediately, and they would take all possible legal measures against me. The proposal was humiliating. I would have to deny the truth, humble myself before the man I knew was a cheater, and still help cover up his crimes. It was cruel emotional blackmail, but I knew I had no choice. I needed that job to survive, and they knew it. At that moment, I realized I was dealing with people much more powerful and manipulative than I imagined. I accepted the humiliation and pretended I had made everything up. On Friday, Mrs. Wellington organized a meeting with some of the people who had heard the rumors so I could clarify the situation. It was one of the most degrading experiences of my life, standing there in front of 5 high society women, admitting I had lied about Mr. Wellington because of personal problems. I made up a story about going through depression, said I had confused things I saw on TV with reality, apologized 1,000 times for the misunderstanding. The women looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. as if I were a mentally ill person who didn't deserve trust. Mr. Wellington was present and made sure to be magnanimous, saying he held no grudge and understood I was going through difficult. His performance was perfect, the kind man forgiving the disturbed employee. But I knew that was just the beginning. During the following 2 weeks, I noticed they were constantly watching me. Mrs. Wellington appeared in the rooms where I was working much more frequently, always with some excuse. Mr. Wellington started leaving small valuable objects scattered around the house, an expensive watch on the living room table, a wallet with money on the kitchen counter, jewelry outside the safe. At first, I thought it was coincidence, but then I understood they were testing me. They wanted to see if I would steal something so they could accuse me of being a thief. It was an obvious trap, so I took extra care not to touch anything that wasn't related to my work. Whenever I saw something valuable out of place, I called Mrs. Wellington to let her know I had found the lost object. Their paranoia increased when they realized I wasn't falling for the simple traps. They started getting more creative and dangerous. One afternoon, I found an envelope with $2,000 in cash forgotten in my coat in the dressing room. Obviously, it was an attempt to frame me. So I immediately took the money to Mrs. Wellington and said someone had put that in my coat by mistake. She pretended surprise and thanked my honesty, but I saw in her eyes that she was frustrated because the plan didn't work. Small, valuable objects also started appearing near the places where I worked. Diamond earrings dropped under the table I cleaned, a ring forgotten in the bathroom where I did the cleaning. It was a systematic attempt to make me look like a thief, but I was always one step ahead. The situation escalated when they realized I wasn't going to fall for the basic traps. Mr. Wellington started messing with the house security system, installing extra cameras in strategic positions. He said it was to protect the family after the incident with me, but I knew it was to watch me. He also changed the location of several valuable objects, placing them in places where I would need to pass during my work. The idea was to film me stealing something he himself had put in my path. But I knew every inch of that house and knew exactly where each thing should be. When I saw something out of place, I discreetly photographed it with my phone before returning it to the correct location. I was documenting all their sabotage attempts. Their final plan was more elaborate and almost worked. On Monday of the 3rd week, Mrs. Wellington said she was going to travel to a convention in Chicago and would be away for 3 days. Mr. Wellington also said he had a business trip to New York in the same period. They asked me to take care of the house alone, do a general cleaning, and organize some papers in the office. It seemed like a normal situation. But I was suspicious because they had never traveled together and left me alone in the house before. On the eve of the trip, I noticed Mr. Wellington was very nervous, checking several times if the cameras were working, messing with drawers that were normally locked. Mrs. Wellington was also strange, giving me very specific instructions about which rooms to clean and in what order. On Tuesday morning, after they traveled, I started my normal cleaning routine. Everything seemed calm until I got to Mr. Wellington's office. On his desk, clearly visible, was a small portable safe open with very expensive jewelry inside, including the diamond necklace from Mrs. Wellington's grandmother that was worth more than $50,000. It was obvious it was a trap, but it was so well set up that for a second I even thought about simply closing the safe and pretending I hadn't seen it. But then I realized there were probably cameras filming everything, and they were going to edit the images to make it look like I was stealing. I took my phone and filmed the whole scene, clearly showing that the safe was open when I arrived and that I didn't touch anything. 2 hours later, Mrs. Wellington returned unexpectedly from the trip, saying the event had been canceled. She went straight to the office and started screaming that her grandmother's jewelry had disappeared. She called the police immediately, saying she had left the safe closed and only I had access to the house. Her performance was impressive: real tears, convincing despair, legitimate indignation. When the police arrived, she directly accused me of stealing the jewelry. It was at that moment I realized how they had planned everything down to the smallest detail. They had created the perfect situation to frame me, opportunity me alone in the house. Motive: I needed money, and access: I knew where the valuable things were. If I hadn't filmed everything, I would certainly have been arrested at that moment. And that's where things get interesting. People. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications because this story still has many twists ahead. The police arrived in less than 15 minutes, and the situation became a complete nightmare. Mrs. Wellington was in an Oscar-worthy performance, crying and repeating that I was the only person who had access to the house, and that she always suspected I was interested in her jewelry. The police treated me like a criminal from the first moment. One of them even asked me to keep my hands where he could see them, as if I were dangerous. They searched my purse, my coat, even asked to check my car that was parked in front of the house. Mrs. Wellington insisted that I had hidden the jewelry somewhere and that they needed to do a complete search. The embarrassment was indescribable. Neighbors started appearing at windows. Some people stopped on the street to see the commotion. In a matter of minutes, my reputation in the neighborhood was destroyed. The most humiliating moment was when Mrs. Wellington suggested that I be personally searched to make sure I wasn't hiding anything on my body. A female police officer took me to the bathroom and made me take off all my clothes, checking every piece, every pocket, even made me open my mouth and lift my hair. It was a humiliation I had never imagined I could go through in life. Meanwhile, Mrs. Wellington stayed outside telling the police how I had made up lies about her husband, how she already suspected I had mental problems and criminal tendencies. She said I always showed too much interest in the expensive things in the house, always asked questions about the value of objects, always complimented her jewelry excessively. Every word that came out of her mouth painted me as an envious and dishonest person. When they found nothing on me, Mrs. Wellington became even more furious and insisted that I had hidden the jewelry somewhere else. She suggested the police go to my house to do a complete search, as they would certainly find the stolen pieces there. Her desperation to frame me was getting too obvious, but the police seemed to believe her version. After all, she was a rich, respectable woman, wife of a known businessman. And I was just a housekeeper with a history of mental problems. The social class difference weighed heavily on the credibility each of us had in the eyes of the law. They were preparing to take me to the police station when I finally managed to show the video I had recorded of the office. The video was my temporary salvation. It clearly showed that when I entered the office, the safe was already open and the jewelry visible. It also showed the timestamp of when it was recorded, proving I had found the situation that way. The police were confused and asked Mrs. Wellington how it was possible for the safe to be open if she had left it closed. Her performance started to crumble. She stuttered, said maybe she had forgotten to close it, that she was very nervous about the trip. But the excuse didn't stick because minutes before she had sworn on her feet that she had left everything locked. That's when the police started suspecting there was something strange about that whole situation. Mrs. Wellington then quickly changed the version of facts. She said the jewelry really hadn't been stolen, that she had gotten confused because she was very stressed in recent days. She apologized to the police for the misunderstanding and said she would compensate their lost time, but the damage was already done. Neighbors had seen the police at the house. Gossip would spread quickly through the neighborhood. She managed to prevent me from being arrested, but my reputation was already ruined. The police left clearly irritated for being called to solve a domestic confusion, but not before warning me that if I had problems with my boss again, they would investigate more thoroughly. The implicit threat was clear. Next time, they wouldn't be so understanding. As soon as the police left, Mrs. Wellington completely took off her mask. The kind and elegant woman disappeared, and in her place was a cold and calculating person I had never seen before. She said I was fired immediately and had 1 hour to collect my things and leave the property. I wouldn't receive any severance pay, any work reference, nothing. On the contrary, she would make sure to tell all her acquaintances about my mental instability and criminal tendency, to ensure I never got work in family homes in Boston again. The coldness with which she spoke was terrifying. It was as if all those months of respectful treatment had been a farce, as if I had never been more than a disposable object in her eyes. The final humiliation came when she accompanied me to my car to make sure I wasn't going to steal anything during my exit. She treated me like a criminal until the last second, checking my purse again, verifying I wasn't taking anything that wasn't mine. Some neighbors were still watching from the window, and she made sure to speak loud enough for them to hear that she was firing me for trust issues. When I finally got in the car and left that street, I was shaking with anger and humiliation. In a matter of hours, I had lost my job, my reputation, and almost my freedom. But what revolted me most was knowing that those two bastards had managed to completely reverse the situation. I, who had tried to help a betrayed woman, was now seen as the villain of the story. They had won that battle, but I knew the war wasn't over yet. In the first days after the dismissal, I was devastated and didn't know what to do. I cried, cursed, thought about giving up on everything, but then anger started speaking louder than despair. I couldn't let those two bastards get away with it after everything they did to me. I started thinking strategically. If they had managed to destroy me using lies, I was going to rebuild my life using the truth. The first step was organizing all the evidence I already had. I reviewed every photo I had taken during those last weeks. Every video, every note I made about Mr. Wellington's strange behavior. I realized I had more material than I imagined. It wasn't just my word against theirs. I had concrete proof that something suspicious was happening in that house. Luck started turning when I remembered I had kept contact with some other housekeepers who worked in the area. There's an informal network among us. We meet at the market, at bus stops, exchange information about jobs and bosses. I called Carmen, a Mexican woman who worked at the Wellingtons' neighbor's house. When I told my version of the facts, she was silent for a while and then said she always thought Mr. Wellington was very strange. Several times she had seen him arriving home at weird hours, always accompanied by a young woman with red hair. They entered through the garage so they wouldn't be seen from the street. But from the kitchen window where Carmen worked, you could see perfectly. She had never commented on anything because it wasn't her business, but now she understood I was telling the truth. Carmen introduced me to other housekeepers in the area who had also observed suspicious things. Rosa, who worked 3 houses down, had seen Mr. Wellington and the redhead leaving a downtown hotel several times during business hours. Maria, who took care of children for a family on the same street, had heard the bosses commenting about the Wellingtons' marital problems long before I was fired. The housekeeper information network was much more efficient than I imagined. They knew everything that happened in that rich neighborhood. They just never had reason to share the information. Now I had witnesses who could corroborate my version of the facts. It wasn't just words from a problematic employee, it was observations from several honest and hardworking people. The breakthrough came when Carmen told me that her boss, Mrs. Thompson, was very gossipy and always knew everything that happened in the neighborhood. She suggested I look for Mrs. Thompson directly because maybe she had valuable information about Mr. Wellington. It was a risky move. I could be expelled from the property or even have the police called again. But I was desperate and needed to try. I went to the Thompsons' house on a Thursday afternoon and explained my situation to Mrs. Thompson. To my surprise, she received me very well and said she always suspected there was something wrong with Mr. Wellington. She had seen strange movements at the neighbor's house, unknown cars parked in the garage, lights on at times they should be traveling. Mrs. Thompson went further and showed me something that changed everything. She had a security system with cameras that covered part of the street, including the entrance to the Wellingtons' garage. As a neighborhood security measure, several houses had agreed to share the images when necessary. She showed me recordings from several dates when Mr. Wellington arrived home with the red-haired woman. Always at times he should be working, or when Mrs. Wellington was traveling. The images were clear enough to identify both of them, entering and leaving together, kissing in the car, behaving like a couple in love. It was exactly the proof I needed to prove I hadn't invented anything. The betrayal was documented on video with date and time, but Mrs. Thompson had something even better. Social connections I could never have. She knew people who frequented the same circles as Mr. Wellington and his mistress. Through these connections, We discovered that Scarlett wasn't just a model. She had a history of getting involved with rich married men. She had already destroyed at least 2 marriages before Mr. Wellington's. She even had a social media profile where she flaunted expensive gifts, luxurious trips and dinners at sophisticated restaurants, always without revealing who was paying for it all. Mrs. Thompson helped me connect the dates of Scarlett's posts with the strange expenses I had seen in Mr. Wellington's papers. It was a perfect trail that proved the extramarital relationship. With all this information in hand, I started putting together a complete dossier about the betrayal. It wasn't just my word anymore. I had photos, videos, witnesses, financial documents, social media posts, everything organized like a real detective work. Mrs. Thompson suggested I look for a lawyer, but I knew I didn't have money to pay legal fees. That's when I had the idea that would change everything. If they had used social media and gossip to destroy me, I could use the same weapons against them. The internet is democratic. Anyone can expose the truth if they have the right evidence. I started planning how I was going to make the public revelation of everything I discovered. It wasn't going to be just personal revenge. It was going to be a public service for all women who were being deceived by men like Mr. Wellington. I spent a whole week planning every detail of what I called Operation Truth. I couldn't simply post the evidence anywhere. I had to be strategic to ensure maximum impact and legal protection for me. First, I created anonymous profiles on various platforms: Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter. I used a VPN to mask my location and a temporary email that couldn't be traced back to me. The plan was to post everything simultaneously on all platforms to ensure the information spread before they could try to block or take down the content. I knew I only had one chance to make it work, so every move had to be perfect. I organized all the evidence into a convincing chronological narrative, with photos, videos, and documents that proved every allegation I was making. The content I created was devastating. I started with a 3-minute video telling my story in summary, explaining how I discovered the betrayal and how I was persecuted by the couple. I included the security camera recordings from Mrs. Thompson showing Mr. Wellington with Scarlett, photos of excessive expenses, screenshots of her social media with expensive gifts on the same dates as his expenses. I created a carousel on Instagram with more than 20 images showing the complete chronology of the betrayal from the first signs to the trap they set to frame me. On TikTok, I made a series of short videos, each revealing a part of the story, always ending with hooks that made people want to see the next episode. The strategy was addictive. People couldn't stop following the developments. To protect identities legally, I censored faces in photos and used pseudonyms, but left enough details for anyone in Boston to recognize who the people involved were. I referred to them as the Beacon Hill businessman and the socialite wife, but included specific details about the house, neighborhood, the company where he worked. Anyone who knew the Wellingtons would know exactly who I was talking about. I also posted in local Facebook groups about Boston happenings, relationship discussion forums, and even on pages that expose betrayals. I used strategic hashtags like #BostonBetrayal, #BetrayedWife, #SocialJustice, #ExposedBoston. In 6 hours, the content had already been seen by more than 50,000 people. The impact was beyond my most optimistic expectations. The social media algorithms picked up the content and started automatically boosting it because it was generating a lot of engagement. People were sharing, commenting, tagging friends, creating discussion threads. In less than 24 hours, the videos had surpassed 200,000 views on TikTok, and the Instagram posts were being reposted on dozens of Boston gossip pages. What impressed me most was the amount of women who started telling their own betrayal stories in the comments. It became a movement where people felt encouraged to expose toxic relationships and emotional abuse situations. I had accidentally created a platform for other victims to speak out. The viralization got out of control in a way I never imagined. Local influencers started making videos reacting to my content. National gossip pages picked up the story. Even some local journalists started investigating the case. In 2 days, #BostonBetrayal was among the city's trending topics. People who knew the Wellingtons started confirming in the comments that it was really about them, sharing other stories about Mr. Wellington's questionable behavior over the years. I discovered I wasn't the first employee he had persecuted. At least 3 other women had gone through similar situations and now felt safe to speak publicly. The exposed had turned into an avalanche of revelations about that man's true personality. The most satisfying moment was when someone in the comments posted a link to Mr. Wellington's professional LinkedIn profile, and people started asking direct questions about the allegations there. The company where he worked started receiving calls and emails from clients questioning whether they could trust a man who deceived his own wife. Some people even canceled investments in consulting with the firm. Professional pressure was growing exponentially, exactly like he had tried to do to me when he spread that I was unstable. The difference is that my allegations were true and had solid evidence to support them. In 3 days, the financial impact on their careers was already being felt concretely. Scarlett also didn't escape. Several people identified her through the censored photos and started exposing her behavior on social media. They discovered she had a pattern of getting involved with married men, always targeting the richest and most influential ones. Modeling agencies started distancing themselves from her. Brands canceled contracts, and she had to lock her social media profiles because she was receiving thousands of negative messages. The most ironic thing is that she tried to make a video defending herself, but only made the situation worse because she indirectly confirmed that everything I had posted was true. The internet is merciless with people who destroy families, and she was discovering that the worst way possible, but I knew they weren't going to accept that public humiliation passively. Their revenge was coming, and it would be much worse than I imagined. Their reaction was quick and brutal. On the first day after the exposed, I received a letter from lawyers accusing me of defamation, slander, and invasion of privacy. They demanded that I remove all content from social media within 48 hours. Otherwise, I would face a millionaire lawsuit that would leave me in debt for the rest of my life. The letter was intimidating, full of legal terms I barely understood. But the message was clear. They were going to use all their financial power to destroy me legally. What scared me most was that they had discovered my real address, my full name, and even information about my family. The privacy I thought I had maintained with anonymous profiles had lasted less than a week. They had resources to hire private investigators and hackers to track me down. 2 days later, direct persecution began. Strange cars appeared on my street, always parked in positions where they could observe my house. They were different vehicles each day, a black SUV, a gray sedan, a white van, but always with people inside looking toward my window. When I left for work, I had gotten a temporary job cleaning offices. They followed me. It was obvious psychological intimidation. They wanted me to know I was being watched constantly. Once, I stopped the car at a diner to force a confrontation. But when I got out, the car that was following me accelerated and disappeared. They were professionals and knew how to do this without leaving concrete evidence. The situation escalated when they started directly interfering in my life. My mother, who lives in Providence, started receiving anonymous calls in the middle of the night. The person on the other end whispered vague threats about what happens to families of people who lie about others. My younger sister, who studies at university, was approached on campus by a man who said he knew our family and asked strange questions about me. They were mapping my entire family network to use as psychological pressure. The scariest thing was when my mother called me crying, saying someone had thrown red paint on her car during the night. It wasn't just about me anymore. They were willing to terrorize innocent people to make me shut up. At work, persecution continued in more subtle but equally devastating ways. My new boss received an anonymous call informing that I had a history of theft and mental problems. Even though I showed that the accusations were false, he was uncomfortable and said maybe it would be better if I looked for another job. It was exactly the strategy Mrs. Wellington had promised to use, destroy my professional reputation to ensure I couldn't support myself financially. They knew that if I became desperate for money, it would be easier to force me to accept a silence agreement. Other job opportunities that appeared mysteriously disappeared after employers received concerning information about my character. Psychological pressure increased when I discovered they had hired people to infiltrate my social circle. A woman named Jennifer started frequenting the same places as me, always starting conversations and asking questions about my personal life. She seemed genuinely interested in being my friend, but later I discovered she was reporting our conversations to the Wellingtons. They wanted information about my emotional state, my future plans, any evidence that I was unstable that they could use against me in court. It was such a deep privacy violation that I felt paranoid about any new person who tried to get close. I didn't know who to trust anymore, if every casual conversation was genuine or part of an undercover investigation. The turning point was when they escalated to direct threats to my physical safety. One night, coming back from work, I found my door broken into and the house ransacked. Nothing had been stolen, but it was clear someone had been looking for something specific. In my bedroom, I found a simple note: "Stop, or the consequences will be worse." I called the police, but they said without evidence of who did it, they couldn't investigate much. It was frustrating to know the Wellingtons had enough money to hire people who knew exactly how to intimidate without leaving traces. They were using mafia tactics against an unemployed housekeeper. It was a frightening disproportion that showed how desperate they were to silence me. The last straw was when I discovered they had tried to bribe Carmen, the housekeeper who had helped me with evidence. They offered $10,000 for her to lie and say I had asked her to make up stories about Mr. Wellington. Carmen told me about the proposal, and we were both terrified by the scope of their operation. They weren't just persecuting me, they were systematically trying to corrupt or intimidate anyone who could corroborate my version of the facts. It was a military operation against the truth, using unlimited financial resources against working people who had no way to defend themselves. At that moment, I realized I was dealing with something much bigger than simple personal revenge. They were willing to do anything to protect their reputation and wealth, even if it... The game changer came from where I least expected it. During all that hellish persecution, I had focused so much on defending myself that I didn't notice other forces were working in my favor. The first surprise was discovering that Mrs. Thompson, the neighbor who helped me with evidence, had much more powerful connections than I imagined. Her husband, who I thought was just a retired businessman, was actually ex-FBI and still maintained important contacts in federal justice. When he found out about the extent of the persecution I was suffering, he decided to use his connections to investigate the Wellingtons' illegal activity. He discovered they had hired a private security company that used questionable methods, including property invasion and witness intimidation, serious federal crimes that could result in prison. The second twist came through the viral exposed I had created. An investigative journalist from the Boston Globe, Thomas McCarthy, had seen my story and decided to investigate further. He started digging into Mr. Wellington's financial life and discovered serious irregularities in his company. There were indications of money laundering, tax evasion, and misuse of client funds to finance his and his mistress's luxurious lifestyle. What started as an investigation about marital betrayal turned into an investigation of large-scale financial crimes. McCarthy had sources inside the company who confirmed that Mr. Wellington had been embezzling money for years. Using complex schemes to hide the thefts, the marital betrayal was just the tip of the iceberg of a much larger criminal operation. The most surprising moment was when Scarlett, the mistress, decided to turn against Mr. Wellington. Public pressure had destroyed her modeling career, and she was facing lawsuits from several ex-wives of men she had seduced. Desperate to save her own skin, she sought out the journalist and offered information in exchange for immunity. She revealed that Mr. Wellington not only embezzled money from the company, but had also blackmailed other rich clients using privileged information he obtained as a financial consultant. She had recordings of conversations where he admitted to crimes, photos of compromising documents, and even evidence that he had forged Mrs. Wellington's signature on several contracts. The woman who should have been his accomplice became the main witness against him. The fall was spectacular and quick. The Boston Globe published a front-page story with the headline, "The Empire of Lies: How an Elite Consultant Stole Millions and Destroyed Families." The report detailed not only the financial crimes, but also the pattern of psychological abuse he used against housekeepers and other vulnerable women. 3 other former employees spoke out publicly, telling stories similar to mine of persecution and intimidation. The FBI opened a formal investigation, and in less than a week, Mr. Wellington was arrested in his own home by a dozen federal agents. The images of his arrest in handcuffs, leaving the Beacon Hill mansion, went around the world. It was poetic justice, the man who tried to destroy me being publicly humiliated in the same way. Mrs. Wellington also didn't escape the consequences. It was discovered that she knew about her husband's financial schemes and had helped launder money through investments in art and jewelry. Furthermore, the investigation revealed that the attempt to frame me for theft was planned down to the smallest details. They had even rehearsed the scene several times to make it look convincing. She was indicted for complicity in money laundering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The woman I had tried to help, who accused me of being envious and lying, was now facing the possibility of spending years in prison. The couple's assets were frozen by justice, including the mansion I cleaned every day. Seeing that luxurious house with FBI tape and seized property signs was one of the most satisfying sights of my life. Personal vindication came when the FBI itself sought me out to be an official witness in the case. They recognized that I had been a victim of intimidation and offered full protection during the process. More than that, my viral exposed was considered a fundamental piece of the investigation because it had encouraged other victims to speak out and had documented crucial evidence. The special agent responsible for the case told me I had done better work than many professional detectives. I received financial compensation from the government for damages suffered during the persecution, and several wealthy Boston families started seeking me out to work, impressed by my integrity and courage. My reputation was not only restored, it was elevated to a level I never imagined possible. But the story doesn't end here. While I was celebrating justice being done, some strange events started happening again. Unknown cars returned to appear on my street, but now they were different from the previous ones. I received an anonymous call saying that other interested parties wanted to talk to me about what I knew. It seems that bringing down the Wellingtons awakened the attention of even more dangerous people who had connections to their financial schemes. Justice was done. But is my fight really over? Or did I end up getting into something even bigger and more dangerous than I imagined? Well, that's a story for another day. If you want to know what happened next, leave it in the comments, and maybe I'll come back here to tell the rest of this crazy saga. So, people, what did you think of this crazy story? Who here has ever been through some situation where they tried to do the right thing and got screwed in the process? And do you think I should tell what happened after, with these mysterious people who appeared wanting to talk to me? One thing I learned from all this: no matter how powerful our enemies are, the truth always finds a way to come to light. Sometimes it takes time, sometimes we get beaten up along the way, but in the end, justice always wins. If this story inspired you in some way, subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, so you don't miss the next videos, and don't forget to write in the comments which city you're watching from. I want to know all of you, who are part of this incredible community we're building together.